The words landed like a slap, casual but sharp enough to leave a mark. "You can sleep in the garage." She'd said it over her shoulder, already walking away, as if I were luggage to be stored, not a mother to be welcomed. That night, I stood in the doorway of her old room, the pale blue walls, the lace curtains stirring in the breeze, knowing this space, once hers, would soon hold someone who saw its worth. Outside, the wind rattled the gutter. Inside, something in me hardened. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you watching from today? Comment below, and don't forget to press the subscribe button. The first years of her life were stitched together with the smallest, sweetest moments, moments that seemed, back then, so ordinary, I never thought they'd be the ones I'd hold on to most. She took her first steps across the cool kitchen tiles, toes curling against the faint grit of flour I'd spilled while baking bread. I was kneeling by the counter, my hands still dusted white, when she let go of the table leg and wobbled toward me. Her face lit up with a smile that had no hesitation in it, only trust. I caught her, of course, and her little fists curled into my collar, holding me as if I were the center of the world. That kitchen, it smelled of yeast and simmering broth most days, of oranges in the winter and cut grass drifting in through the back door in summer. I used to hum to her while she sat in her high chair, kicking her legs against the wooden rung, pressing mashed carrot into her cheeks like war paint. The small bedroom at the end of the hall became hers the day she turned 3. We painted it together, or rather, I painted while she dipped the brush into too much paint and left fat streaks of blue at ankle height. A pale, soft blue, the kind you see in porcelain teacups. The scent of fresh paint mixed with lavender from the sachet I tucked into her dresser drawer. That room became her little kingdom, its shelves filling with paperbacks, mismatched mugs, and jars of seashells she insisted were treasures. When she was 7, she started bringing me flowers. Not bouquets, just single stems plucked from the yard, a dandelion, a daisy, sometimes a sprig of lilac she could barely carry without dropping petals along the hallway. She'd present them solemnly, saying, for no reason, and I'd put them in the chipped cream vase on the kitchen table. Even as she grew older, there were evenings we'd sit together, just the two of us, with tea. She liked hers too sweet, with milk that left pale clouds swirling in the cup. She'd tell me about a book she was reading, or a friend's ridiculous story from school, her voice animated, her hands moving as if to sketch the scenes in the air. Those were the nights I felt like her best friend as well as her mother. But there were moments, tiny ones, so easy to overlook, when a different tone would slip into her voice. The first time I noticed it was when a school friend came over. I walked into her room to bring them cookies, and she sighed in a way she never had before, saying, "Oh, Mom, you didn't have to." The girl laughed softly, and they exchanged a look I couldn't quite read. It was small, but it stayed with me. Later, in her teenage years, she started closing the bedroom door more often. Privacy, she said, though she still let me in sometimes to help her choose what to wear for a school dance or to fix a hem. I'd sit on the edge of her bed, the lavender scent faint but always there, and watch her twist her hair in the mirror. She was beautiful, even when she rolled her eyes at my suggestions. We still had our quiet rituals. On rainy days, we'd curl up on the couch with blankets and watch old films. She'd rest her head against my shoulder, half asleep by the second act. I'd feel the weight of her there and think, perhaps foolishly, that no matter how the world changed, this closeness would be ours forever. The day she graduated high school, the bedroom looked just as it had when she was small, though the books were heavier now, and the seashell jars had been replaced by bottles of perfume and photographs. I stood in the doorway as she packed for university, trying not to let her see my face when she folded away her favorite blanket, the one with the worn edges I'd mended twice. She hugged me before she left, her arms firm around my shoulders, and said, "I'll call you every week." And she did, at first. Sundays, mostly, telling me about her classes and new friends, her voice bright with the excitement of her new life. It's funny, in the good years, you don't think to name them as such. You think it's just life, unfolding. You don't imagine you'll ever stand in the same rooms years later, trying to hold on to the sound of a laugh, the smell of lavender, the sight of a little girl walking toward you across kitchen tiles, arms outstretched. If I had known how quickly those days would fade, would have slowed them down, just to keep her with me a little longer. It started quietly, as most distances do. Not with an argument, not with slammed doors, but with the slow erosion of time and habit. When she left for university, I told myself I wouldn't be the kind of mother who called every day, who clung. I wanted her to feel free, to believe I trusted her to build her own life. So I kept my calls to Sundays, like we'd agreed, and I made a point of filling the days between with my own routines. Her bedroom stayed exactly as she'd left it, bed made, seashell jars lined up along the windowsill, books stacked in uneven towers beside the desk. I would open the curtains each morning so the light could pool across the pale blue walls, the same light that once woke her for school. Sometimes I'd stand in the doorway longer than necessary, as if I might catch the echo of her voice if I waited. At first, the calls were full of detail. She told me about the history professor with wild hair and a tendency to lose his notes mid-lecture, the late-night coffee shop where students read poetry into a microphone, the way the city smelled different, sharper, with an undercurrent of exhaust. I'd listen, smiling at the sound of her voice, imagining her walking along busy streets with her scarf pulled tight against the wind. But over the months, the calls began to shorten. I'd ask a question, and she'd answer quickly before turning the subject elsewhere, or saying she had to run because someone was waiting for her. The pauses between our words grew longer, the goodbyes more hurried. I told myself it was natural. She was busy. Young people were always busy. When she came home for her first visit, it was December. I had baked her favorite cinnamon bread, the scent filling the whole house. She hugged me at the door, but her eyes were already scanning the living room for her phone charger. She unpacked just enough to find the sweater she'd forgotten to take to school, leaving the rest of her things in her suitcase. At dinner that night, with just the two of us, I asked if she'd made any close friends. She smiled and told me about a girl named Hannah who lived down the hall, about how they stayed up talking until sunrise. I said it sounded lovely, and meant it, though a small, unexpected ache stirred in my chest. It wasn't until spring, when she came home again for a long weekend, that I felt the first real sting. We'd been invited to a small family dinner at my sister's house. Around the table, laughter came easily, stories spilling from every direction. At one point, my sister teased me about my habit of saving every glass jar that passed through the kitchen. I laughed along, it was true, but my daughter leaned in, grinning, and said, "Oh, you have no idea. She's got enough jars to survive the apocalypse." Everyone laughed, even I did, but something in her tone, the little roll of her eyes, the easy way she offered me up for amusement, caught me off guard. It wasn't cruel, exactly. Just careless. I saw in that moment how different she was around others, how much more willing she was to make me the punchline. That night, when we returned home, she went straight to her room and shut the door. I lingered in the hallway, hearing the faint murmur of her voice on the phone to someone else. I imagined her telling stories about the evening, about me, and for the first time I wondered what she said when I wasn't there to hear it. Her visits became less frequent after that. Sometimes she'd say she couldn't get away because of schoolwork. Other times it was because of work shifts at the cafe where she'd started part-time. I told myself it was the way things went, children grew into their own lives, and parents learned to take up less space in them. Still, I kept the room ready. I washed the sheets after every visit, dusted the shelves, kept the lavender sachet fresh. On quiet mornings, I'd sit on the edge of her bed with a cup of tea, looking out the window at the maple tree in the yard. I'd watch its branches shift through the seasons, bare in winter, budding in spring, blazing in autumn, a reminder that change was constant, inevitable. Once, when she called to say she couldn't make it home for the holidays, I asked if everything was all right. She hesitated before saying, "Of course. I just think it's easier this year." Easier. The word sat heavy in the air after the call ended. Easier than what? Than seeing me? Than being here? The first distance wasn't a break, not yet. It was a stretching, like taffy pulled thinner and thinner until you could almost see through it. And I told myself, as mothers do, that if I just kept loving her in the same steady way, the space between us would close again. But some spaces only widen. It was late in the summer, the air heavy with the scent of cut grass and warm earth, when she called with the news. Her voice carried that bright, almost rehearsed excitement people use when they want to get through a big announcement before you can interrupt. She was engaged. I pressed the phone tighter to my ear, smiling into the emptiness of my kitchen. "That's wonderful," I said, and meant it in part, though I knew almost nothing about the man. She said his name quickly, as if expecting I'd recognize it, then filled in only the barest details. They'd met at the cafe where she worked. He was in finance. He had a good head on his shoulders. I pictured someone crisp and efficient, a man who kept his shoes polished and his desk tidy. Someone who, perhaps, would be kind to her. That was all I hoped for. She brought him to meet me the following month. His handshake was firm, his smile wide, but his eyes flickered away from mine the moment they met. He commented on the house almost immediately. Charming place. Feels lived in. He said it with a sort of polite hesitation, as if searching for a word that wasn't old. At dinner, he asked about my work before retirement, but his attention seemed to drift halfway through my answer. My daughter, though, was radiant in his presence, leaning toward him, laughing at his smallest jokes. I noticed the way she looked to him for a cue before answering certain questions, as though the two of them shared an unspoken script. Over the next year, I saw them together a handful of times. In public, at a family barbecue, at a cousin's wedding, he was charming, attentive, quick to offer help. But in quieter moments, his attention to me was minimal, and sometimes tinged with faint amusement, as though I were a relic from a different world. One afternoon, when they came for tea, I offered him a slice of my lemon cake. He thanked me, then glanced at my daughter with a half-smile and said, "Your mom's really holding on to these old recipes, isn't she?" My daughter laughed, not the warm laugh I remembered from her childhood, but something sharper, thinner. I smiled along, but inside, something shifted. It was during these visits that I began to notice a subtle change in her. If I disagreed with him about something small, the quickest route to the market, the cost of electricity, she would side with him without hesitation. Once, when I tried to share a story from her childhood, he interrupted to make a joke, and instead of picking up the thread for me, she let it drop. After they left, the house felt different. Not just quieter, but heavier, as though their presence had unsettled something in the walls. I'd walk through the rooms, straightening chairs that didn't need straightening, feeling the way absence can be louder than company. When she called, her updates began to include him more and herself less. "We went hiking this weekend. We've been looking at properties. We're saving for the wedding." I tried to ask about her job, her friends, her books, but the answers grew short, distracted. She always had somewhere to be. The first real sting came one afternoon when I mentioned that I'd been feeling lonely. I didn't mean it as a plea, just a passing truth, like mentioning the weather. She sighed and said, "Mom, you really need to get out more. You can't just sit in that house forever." Her tone wasn't cruel, but it carried a distance I hadn't heard before, a tone that suggested my life had somehow narrowed in her eyes. I wanted to tell her that this house was full of my life, that the garden out back was a living quilt of years, that the shelves inside carried more stories than any cafe conversation could. But instead, I just said, "I'll try." When the engagement party came, I dressed carefully, a soft blue dress, the same shade as her bedroom walls, though she wouldn't have noticed. The room was full of people I didn't know, laughter and clinking glasses echoing off polished floors. She moved through the crowd with ease, his hand at the small of her back, stopping to introduce me as "my mom," in a quick, passing way before whisking someone else into conversation. At one point, I overheard him telling a group that my house was quaint and very traditional. I knew, even without hearing the rest, what traditional meant in his mouth. I stepped outside for air, the summer evening pressing warm against my skin, and realized I'd been holding my breath. By the time the party ended, I understood something quietly devastating: the axis of her loyalty had shifted. She would stand beside him, even if it meant standing across from me. And so the good years faded further into the distance, and a new chapter, one of smaller smiles, measured words, and careful silences, began. It was one of those early spring days when the air carries both the promise of warmth and the bite of leftover winter. The maple out front had only the faintest fuzz of green on its branches, and the light through the kitchen window was pale, almost tentative. I was kneading bread when the phone rang. Her voice was bright, rushed, the kind of tone she used when she had news she'd been rehearsing in her head. "They'd bought a new house," she said. "Bigger than the apartment, with a garden you'd love, and a wide porch where she imagined sipping coffee in the mornings. But there was a catch: they were renovating before moving in." I told her it sounded wonderful, meaning it in the way you mean it for someone who's already decided their life will change in a particular direction. I imagined her in that garden, though I wasn't sure if she'd really spend much time there. She mentioned they'd be staying temporarily with his parents during the renovations. Then, after a pause that seemed to last a little too long, she added, "And if you want to come see the new place, you can sleep in the garage." The words landed strangely, not quite cruel, not even said with malice. She laughed lightly, as if it were a practical, harmless suggestion. "We'll put a space heater in there," she added quickly. "It'll just be for a few weeks." The garage. I pictured it immediately: concrete floor, the sharp smell of motor oil, boxes stacked like awkward towers, the faint draft from the gaps under the door. I imagined trying to sleep with that kind of cold settling into my bones. I wiped my hands on my apron, forcing a laugh. "The garage? Well," she said, as if explaining something obvious, "we'll have contractors in the house, dust everywhere. It's just easier. You understand." I did understand, though perhaps not in the way she intended. The image of the pale blue bedroom upstairs, her old room, rose in my mind. The sunlight spilling across the quilt, the lavender sachet in the drawer, the years of memories layered into the walls. That was where she'd slept for 18 years. And now she was telling me a garage would do for me. "I see," I said quietly. "You're not upset, are you?" she asked, a trace of caution in her voice. "No," I lied. "It's fine. Whatever works for you." She seemed relieved at that, quickly changing the subject to their new appliances, the deals they'd found on tiles. I listened, making the appropriate noises, though my mind had already drifted. After we hung up, I went upstairs. The air in her old room was cool, but the smell, that faint mix of lavender and old paper, was still there. I stood in the doorway for a long time, my hand on the frame. The light through the lace curtains painted soft patterns on the floorboards. It was hard not to think of the nights I'd tucked her in here, the mornings I'd called her to breakfast. I sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress gave under my weight, the way it always had, and I smoothed my hand across the quilt. I thought about the distance that had grown between us, the missed calls, the careful silences, the way her laughter had changed. And now, this. It wasn't just the suggestion of the garage. It was what it meant. It was the quiet reordering of importance, the way I'd been moved from the center of her life to the outer edges, somewhere cold and out of sight. I stayed in that room until the light faded, until the patterns on the floor blurred into shadows. Over the next few days, I went about my routines as if nothing had happened. I baked bread, weeded the garden, fixed the loose handle on the back door. But something in me had shifted, not with a bang, but with the slow, certain movement of a door closing. I began to think differently about the house, about the rooms inside it. The pale blue room upstairs wasn't just a museum of the past, it was space, warmth, shelter. A gift I'd been keeping for someone who might never truly value it again. The suggestion about the garage might have been offered lightly, but it landed like a small stone in water, sending ripples out farther than she could see. Somewhere in those ripples, a thought began to form, quiet, unfinished, but growing. If your own child suggested you sleep in their garage, how would you respond? The days after that phone call unfolded with a kind of deliberate quiet, as though the house itself had absorbed my unspoken thoughts and decided not to disturb them. I rose early each morning, as I always had, though now the air felt sharper, the light through the kitchen window more brittle. My breakfast rituals, boiling water, measuring tea leaves, slicing a piece of bread still warm from yesterday's baking, became slower, almost meditative. The clink of the spoon in my mug, the steady hum of the kettle, the soft creak of the floorboards under my slippers, they were small, anchoring sounds in a week that felt unmoored. Upstairs, the pale blue room waited exactly as I'd left it. I no longer went in with the same casual tenderness I once had. Instead, I lingered outside the doorway, like someone approaching a place of worship they're no longer sure they believe in. The lace curtains shifted in the late winter drafts, casting slow-moving shadows across the quilt. I could smell the lavender sachet even from the hall, a scent that once meant home and now carried a faint ache of something misplaced. I filled my days with the things that had always steadied me. In the garden, I trimmed back the bare rose bushes, my gloves damp with cold soil. The earth was still stubbornly hard, but I knew it would loosen soon. I spoke aloud to the plants as I worked, a habit I'd never quite outgrown, telling them they'd have their time again. The neighborhood was quiet, except for the occasional car passing or the low murmur of voices from the corner store. I began taking longer walks. Past the park with the empty swings, past the row of houses with their uneven fences, down to the small bridge where the creek ran under a tangle of willow branches. Sometimes I'd see the new family at the corner store, a young couple with 2 children, the youngest always clutching a stuffed rabbit. We'd exchange polite nods, nothing more. Still, there was something comforting about the sight of them, the simple, uncalculated way they belonged to each other. The phone rang less that month. When it did, my daughter's voice was brisk, her words clipped by whatever she was hurrying off to do. She would tell me about a wallpaper sample she liked, or the way the new tiles caught the afternoon light. Once, she mentioned they'd had dinner with his parents, who were so helpful with the renovations. I listened, adding small encouragements here and there, but never mentioned the garage again. I told myself I didn't want an apology, but in truth, I think I wanted something subtler, for her to remember without being reminded. For her to hear her own words in her mind and feel them the way they had landed on me. The house, in those weeks, began to feel less like a place I was keeping for her and more like a place that belonged wholly to me again. I noticed the sound of rain on the roof at night, a deep, slow rhythm I hadn't paid attention to in years. I moved a chair from the living room to the kitchen corner, where the afternoon light was warmest, and began sitting there with my tea instead of at the table. One afternoon, while dusting the hallway shelves, I found a photograph tucked between 2 books. It was of her at about 12 years old, holding a bunch of wildflowers I knew she'd gathered from the far edge of the yard. She was grinning into the sun, her hair falling across her face. I set the photograph on the desk in her room, but later, when I passed by, I moved it to my own bedside table. The shift was small, but I felt it, as if I'd begun to gather pieces of myself I'd been leaving scattered for years. It was during one of these quiet days that I first noticed the empty house across the street. The curtains had been drawn for months, the front steps gathering leaves and windblown wrappers. The sight of it unsettled me. A house without a heartbeat is a lonely thing. But it also made me think about how spaces can change their meaning, how they can wait for someone new to give them life again. By the end of those silent weeks, I realized I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for a phone call, not for a visit, not for some gesture to confirm my place. The garage suggestion had been the sharp edge of something I'd been trying not to name. She saw me as an afterthought. And so, in the stillness of my days, something else began to take root, not anger, but readiness. I didn't yet know what for. Only that it would be mine to decide. It was a Thursday when I met her, one of those days that begins without any hint that it will matter. The morning had been grey, a steady drizzle misting the air, the kind of weather that makes you want to wrap yourself in a shawl and stay inside. But I had promised Mrs. Patel from 2 streets over that I'd drop off the stack of knitted hats I'd made for the community center's winter drive, so I pulled on my raincoat and set out. The center was warm when I stepped inside, the kind of warmth that smells faintly of coffee and disinfectant. Volunteers moved between tables, sorting boxes of canned food and folded clothes. At the far corner, near the tea urn, sat a woman I hadn't seen before. She was quiet, her hands wrapped around a paper cup, eyes lowered to the steam. Mrs. Patel called to me, pulling me into a hug, then went back to sorting jackets. I found myself standing near the table where the woman sat. She looked up when I approached, dark eyes, rimmed with exhaustion, but clear. She nodded politely. "Tea?" I asked, gesturing toward the urn. She hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Yes, please." Her accent was soft, rounded in a way I couldn't place. I poured a cup, and as I set it down in front of her, she said, "Thank you," the word careful, as though she'd learned it not long ago. We spoke in fragments at first, where she was from, the coast, she said, without naming the country, how long she'd been here, 3 months. She told me her name was Miriam. She lived in a small rented room nearby, though she didn't call it home. The word seemed to catch in her throat. As we talked, I learned that she had come alone. Her husband was gone, lost was the word she used, and her parents had stayed behind. She carried with her one suitcase, a scarf from her mother, and a folded photograph of a shoreline I imagined was from her childhood. When I asked what she did for work, she smiled without humor. "Anything they give me. Cleaning. Lifting. Cooking. Not much pay." She shrugged, as though the fact were as fixed as the weather. What I noticed most wasn't the sadness, though it was there, quiet and constant, but the way she held herself. Shoulders drawn slightly in, not from fear exactly, but from living in a world that might push her aside at any moment. A few weeks passed before I saw her again. This time she was at the market, examining a bruised apple as though it were gold. I called her name, and the way her face lit up made me think of a person recognizing a safe harbor. We walked together for a while, her small cloth bag swinging from her hand. It became a pattern. We would see each other at the center, or on the street, and share tea or conversation. I learned she liked to walk at dawn because the air was cleaner then. She had a habit of smoothing the edge of her headscarf when she was thinking. She never complained about her situation, but once, after a long silence, she said, "I had a kitchen once. It smelled of cardamom and bread. I think of it when I am tired." That night, I sat in the pale blue room upstairs. The thought came quietly at first, the way water seeps through the smallest crack, but once it was there, it didn't leave. This room, with its quilt and its shelves, its lavender scent and its view of the maple tree, had been empty far too long. I imagined Miriam waking here to sunlight through the lace curtains. I imagined the sound of her kettle in the morning, the scent of her spices mingling with the old wooden walls. I imagined her feeling, if only for a while, that she belonged somewhere again. But another thought followed, sharper, heavier. My daughter had not slept in this room for years, yet her voice had claimed it by absence, keeping it as some unspoken reserve for herself. She had been willing to offer me a garage. Would she have been willing to offer this room to someone who truly needed it? I already knew the answer. In the days that followed, Miriam's image in this room became clearer. I found myself lingering longer in our conversations, asking small questions about her cooking, her favorite colors, the kind of books she read. She always answered with that same careful politeness, though her eyes warmed each time. The garden began to stir in early spring, and one afternoon I invited her to see it. She bent over the soil with a kind of reverence, touching the first shoots as though greeting old friends. "These will be beautiful," she said softly. I thought about that, how some people can see beauty in what is still only a promise. By the time she left that day, the decision was beginning to root itself inside me. It wasn't fully formed, but it was alive. And I knew, with a certainty I couldn't yet explain, that this house, and that room, would soon have a new story to tell. The call came on a damp, gray afternoon, the kind of day where clouds hang low enough to make the world feel smaller. I had been mending the loose hem of a curtain in the sitting room when the phone rang. My daughter's name lit up the screen, and for a brief, foolish moment, I let myself imagine it might be a call just to ask how I was. It wasn't. Her voice was brisk, a clipped version of the warmth I used to know. She said the renovations were more expensive than they'd anticipated. They just needed a bit of help to get through the next few months. "How much?" I asked, though I already knew the answer would not be small. She hesitated. "5,000. Just to keep things moving." I told her I couldn't. Not that I wouldn't, but that I couldn't. My savings were for my living, for the roof over my head, for the quiet, ordinary needs of a life lived carefully. There was a pause, then a sigh heavy enough to travel down the line. "I just thought," she said, her voice cooling, "after everything I've done for you." I waited for her to finish the sentence, but she didn't. There was only silence, then a flat, "Fine. Forget it." She hung up without goodbye. The house felt very still after that. I set the phone down on the table and sat there for a long while, my hands resting in my lap, the half-mended curtain pooling on the floor beside me. That evening, I went upstairs to her old room. The pale blue walls seemed to hold the fading light in a softer way than the rest of the house. I opened the window a crack, letting in the cool air, and the lace curtain shifted like it was breathing. I pulled the quilt from the bed and carried it down to the laundry. Washed it. Hung it out to dry, the wind tugging at the corners as though trying to claim it. Then I stripped the bed entirely, fresh sheets, fresh pillowcases, the lavender sachet replaced with a new one. It wasn't just cleaning. It was preparing. 2 days later, I found Miriam outside the community center, waiting for the bus. She looked tired, the kind of tired that lives in your bones. I asked if she wanted to come by for tea. She hesitated, then smiled, the sort of smile that says yes even before the word is spoken. We walked to my house in an easy quiet. In the kitchen, the kettle hissed, the scent of mint tea rising. She sat at the table, her hands curled around the warm cup, and told me about her week. A man at work had called her "foreign girl" in a tone she didn't like. She hadn't answered, but she'd thought about it all evening. When the cups were empty, I said, "There's something I want to ask you." Her eyes lifted, cautious. "I have a room," I said. "Upstairs. It's been empty for a long time. You could stay there, if you want. No rent. Just a place to rest." Her hand went to her scarf, smoothing the edge. "You are serious?" "I wouldn't say it if I wasn't." She didn't speak right away. Her eyes moved toward the window, where the garden was beginning to green again, then back to me. And then, very softly, she said, "Yes." When she arrived with her suitcase 2 days later, she stood in the doorway of the room for a long moment before stepping inside. Her hand brushed the quilt. She looked at the window, the maple tree beyond it, the shelves waiting to be filled. "I will take care of it," she said, almost to herself. That night, after she had gone to bed, I stood at the bottom of the stairs and listened to the small sounds of another life settling into the house, the creak of floorboards, the faint closing of a door. It was a sound I hadn't realized I'd missed. And somewhere deep inside me, past the hurt and the quiet years and the garage suggestion, a kind of warmth began to stir again. Would you give away your child's old room if they treated you like a burden? The first mornings with Miriam in the house were different, not loud or bustling, just warm in a way I hadn't felt in years. I would wake to the faint, earthy scent of cardamom drifting down the hall, mingling with the sharper bite of my own black tea. She rose early, her steps light on the stairs, and I could hear the soft clink of a spoon against a cup before I even left my bed. We began to fall into a rhythm without ever sitting down to plan one. Breakfast was simple: bread, cheese, fruit, eaten at the small kitchen table while the light shifted across the walls. Sometimes we spoke, sometimes we didn't. There was comfort in both. In the afternoons, we worked in the garden together. Miriam would kneel in the dirt, her headscarf pinned back from her face, planting seedlings with a tenderness that reminded me of the way I used to tuck my daughter into bed. She hummed sometimes, low and steady, and though I didn't recognize the tune, it seemed to belong to the soil itself. One day, as she was pressing marigold seeds into the earth, she said, "In my country, these are for the dead." She looked at me, a small, wry smile on her lips. "But here, they will be for life." The pale blue room changed quickly under her care. She unpacked her small suitcase into the dresser drawers, lined the shelves with a few books she'd found secondhand, and placed her mother's scarf, soft and faded, across the back of the chair by the window. She sewed curtains for the window out of cream-colored fabric, embroidered with tiny green leaves, and when she hung them, the room seemed to inhale and exhale in a new rhythm. Evenings became our time. She would make her spiced tea, the air filling with cinnamon and cloves, while I set out 2 mismatched mugs. We sat by the window when it was warm, at the kitchen table when it wasn't, sharing stories in no particular order. She told me about the sea near her childhood home, how the waves were rougher in winter but always the same deep blue. I told her about the summer my daughter was 8 and tried to build a treehouse in the maple out front, how the nails bent in her small hands. There was no pressure to fill every silence. Sometimes, after she'd gone to her room, I would hear her moving about softly, opening a drawer, turning a page. The sound no longer felt like an intrusion. It felt like the heartbeat of the house. She began finding small ways to give back. She mended a tear in my cardigan without saying anything, leaving it folded neatly on my bed. She brought home a bag of lemons one day and baked a tart that tasted of sunlight. She swept the kitchen floor without being asked, humming under her breath. I realized, slowly, that I was smiling more, not the polite smile I'd worn in recent years, but the kind that arrived unannounced. And yet, there was an awareness in the back of my mind, a quiet tension that surfaced whenever the phone rang. My daughter's calls were still infrequent, and when they came, her voice carried a faint wariness I couldn't quite name. I didn't mention Miriam. Not yet. One Sunday, Miriam came home from work with a small potted plant, basil, its leaves bright and tender. She set it on the kitchen windowsill. "Every home needs something green to eat from," she said. I nodded, thinking how the same could be said of people. It wasn't that Miriam filled the space my daughter had left, it was that she treated it with care. The pale blue room wasn't a relic anymore. It was lived in, its air carrying both lavender and cardamom, its shelves holding new stories alongside the old. And for the first time in a long while, I felt that the house and I were both being looked after. It happened on a Tuesday, though it could have been any day, one of those unremarkable afternoons when the air is steady and the hours move without hurry. I was in the garden, coaxing stubborn weeds from the soil, when Mrs. Ellis from across the street stopped at the gate. She leaned on it the way she always did, chin jutting slightly forward in her way of sharing news. "I see you've got company these days," she said, her voice warm but curious. "She's lovely. From the market, isn't she?" I smiled, brushing soil from my gloves. "Yes. Miriam. She's staying here for a while." Mrs. Ellis nodded, told me about her own daughter's visit, then carried on down the street. I thought little of it, just neighborly talk. But 2 days later, my phone rang. My daughter's voice came sharp from the first syllable. "Why didn't you tell me someone's living in my room?" The word "my" hung in the air like an accusation. "It's not your room anymore," I said, my tone calm but deliberate. Her breath caught audibly on the line. You could have at least told me. You didn't tell me you were planning to put me in a garage, I said quietly, not as a jab but as a fact. There was a pause, long enough for me to hear the faint noise of traffic on her end. That's not the same, she said finally. It is to me. Silence again. Then, with a tightness in her voice I recognized from when she was a child and didn't get her way, she said, I just think it's disrespectful. Giving my room to some stranger. She's not a stranger, I replied. And she needed a place to stay. The room was empty. That's not the point. It's exactly the point, I said, my voice still steady. A home is meant to be lived in, not kept for someone who no longer needs it. I could hear her breathing, sharp, quick. I don't want to talk about this anymore, she said. Then the line went dead. The house was very quiet after that. I stood in the kitchen, phone still in hand, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator. Through the window, I could see Miriam in the garden, kneeling among the marigolds, her hands gentle in the soil. That evening, she must have noticed something in my face, because she asked, Is everything all right? Yes, I said after a moment. Just a conversation that had to happen. She nodded, not pressing for details. That was one of the things I valued most about her. She didn't demand entry into every corner of my life, but she tended to the corners I let her see. Over the following week, I found myself thinking often about ownership, not of things, but of space, of memory. My daughter seemed to believe that her absence still held a claim, that the four walls of that pale blue room were somehow sealed off from the passage of time. But I had lived here every day she had not. I had carried the bills, the upkeep, the quiet evenings. I had dusted that room, aired it out, kept it waiting, not because I owed her a preserved childhood, but because I couldn't quite let go of what it represented. Now, with Miriam there, the room had a different life. I could hear it in the faint sounds at night, the click of a lamp being switched off, the slow creak of the bed as she settled in. It wasn't holding its breath anymore. A few days later, while folding laundry, I thought about the way my daughter's voice had sharpened on the word my. As if she had forgotten that respect is a two-way exchange, not something inherited like property. I didn't regret giving Miriam the room. Not for a second. If anything, the conversation had clarified something for me, the lines I was willing to draw, and the ones I no longer cared to defend. That night, I brought Miriam a small vase of flowers from the garden. She placed them on the desk by the window, smiling as if it were a gift far greater than it was. Thank you, she said simply. You're welcome, I replied. And I meant it, not just for the flowers, but for the quiet companionship she brought into this house, for the way she treated it, and me, with a respect that had nothing to do with blood. The moment I realized my spine had straightened without my telling it to came on an ordinary morning. Miriam was at the kitchen table, sewing a button back onto her coat, the radio murmuring in the background. I was rinsing dishes when she said, without looking up, they made a joke at work yesterday. About my accent. I laughed, but it didn't feel right. I turned off the tap. What did you say? Nothing, she admitted. It is easier that way. I dried my hands, sat across from her. Sometimes it's not easier, I said. Sometimes silence is just permission you didn't mean to give. She looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly, like a seed settling deeper into soil. The next week, I stopped by the shop where she worked to bring her lunch. I arrived just as one of her coworkers was making a loud imitation of her voice. It was meant to be funny, light-hearted, but I saw the way Miriam's shoulders tightened. Not very clever, I said, stepping forward before I had even decided to. My voice was calm but carried enough weight that the man's grin faltered. You can do better than mocking someone who speaks more than one language. The silence that followed was short but sharp. Miriam's eyes met mine, not with embarrassment, but with something steadier. Pride, maybe. After that, small moments began to shift. Miriam corrected people gently when they mispronounced her name. She started wearing her scarf in brighter colors. And I noticed, without planning it, that I too was less inclined to bend myself into shapes that made other people comfortable. My daughter called once during those weeks. Her tone was distant, her words wrapped in politeness so thin it was almost transparent. "I just hope you're being careful," she said, as if offering a warning. "You don't really know her." I could have argued. I could have reminded her that trust is earned through actions, not bloodlines. Instead, I said, "I know her better than you think." A few days later, an envelope arrived in the mail. My daughter's handwriting was on the front, neat, deliberate. Inside was a letter, short and pointed. She wrote that she felt I had overstepped boundaries, that she needed space to decide how she wanted our relationship to continue. The language was formal, almost as if she'd found it in a self-help book. I read it twice. Then I folded it neatly, slid it into a drawer, and closed it without any real intention of replying. Something had changed in me. Not bitterness, that was a poison I'd never wanted to drink, but a kind of unshakable clarity. I had spent years preserving space for someone who no longer valued it. Now, I was giving that space to someone who did, and I would not apologize for it. One afternoon, Miriam brought home a loaf of bread she'd baked herself. The crust was dark and crisp, the inside still warm. As we ate it with butter, she said, "You are stronger than you look." I smiled. "So are you." Strength doesn't always arrive with a grand gesture. Sometimes it comes quietly, like a door that's been stuck for years finally swinging open. And once it does, you wonder why you ever thought you couldn't move it. If your child tried to guilt you for helping someone else, would you back down? It was early autumn when she came to the door. The leaves had just begun their slow surrender to gold and rust, and the air carried that particular scent of earth turning in on itself. I was in the kitchen, slicing apples for a tart, when the doorbell rang, 2 quick presses, the way she'd done since she was a teenager. When I opened the door, she stood there with her arms folded, a faint flush in her cheeks from the wind. Her eyes scanned past me into the hallway, the way a visitor might. "Can I come in?" she asked. "Of course." She stepped inside, setting her bag on the floor without removing her coat. Her voice was brisk, almost businesslike. "I was in the area. Thought I should see you. But I knew this wasn't a social call." We sat in the living room, the light falling through the window in slanted bands. She didn't comment on the changes, the new curtains Miriam had sewn, the basil plant on the windowsill, but I saw her eyes register them. "I hear she's still here," she said finally. "Yes. Miriam lives here now. She's in my room." I let the word settle. "It hasn't been your room for a long time." Her jaw tightened. "That's not the point. You didn't even ask me. You just gave it away to some stranger." I leaned back in my chair. "I didn't give it away. I offered it to someone who needed it. That's what homes are for. She's not family." I held her gaze. "Family isn't a title you're born with. It's a role you choose to honor." Her eyes flickered, hurt, or anger, or both. "You've changed," she said, as if it were an accusation. "I've stopped waiting," I replied. There was a pause long enough for the ticking clock on the mantel to make itself known. She glanced toward the stairs, and I knew she was picturing the pale blue room as it had been, the bed, the shelves, the lavender sachet in the drawer. I also knew she was imagining the woman who now occupied it. "I don't know if I can forgive you for this," she said at last. I rose, walked to the window, and looked out at the garden. The marigolds were still bright, stubborn against the cooling air. "You don't have to forgive me," I said. "But you do have to respect that this is my home, and my decision." She stood, pulling her coat tighter. "Maybe I shouldn't have come." "That's always your choice," I said gently. At the door, she hesitated. For a moment, I thought she might reach for me, some small bridge back across the widening space between us. But she only nodded once and stepped out into the fading light. I closed the door softly behind her. The house was quiet again, but it wasn't the same kind of quiet as before. This silence was clean, settled. Upstairs, I heard the faint sound of Miriam moving in her room, and the scent of cardamom drifted down the stairs. I returned to the kitchen, sliced the rest of the apples, and thought how some doors close with a slam, but others, the ones that matter, close with a steady, final click. It was late winter when her voice returned to my phone, softer than I remembered, though still carrying that careful edge. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Things with Daniel, they're not great," she said. There was a pause, a faint exhale. "I might need somewhere to stay. Just for a while." I leaned back in my chair, watching the pale afternoon light stretch across the kitchen floor. "I see," I said. "I was thinking," she continued, "I could have my old room. It would just be temporary, until I figure things out." I let the silence breathe between us, not rushing to fill it. Through the open window, I could hear Miriam in the garden, her voice low as she spoke to the marigolds. Yes, she still talked to them as if they could answer. "The room is taken," I said at last, my tone steady. "It's Miriam's home now." There was a small hitch in her voice when she said, "But it's mine." "It was," I replied gently. "Not anymore." The line went quiet. I could almost hear her mind moving, piecing together the years between then and now, the conversations and silences, the choices that had led us to this moment. After a beat, I added, "The garage is still there, though." Her inhale was sharp, but she said nothing. A faint rustle on the line, maybe she'd turned away from the phone, and then, "I'll figure something out." When the call ended, I sat for a while, letting the air settle. I didn't feel triumphant, not in the way revenge is often imagined. There was no rush of victory, no giddy satisfaction. Only a quiet balance, like a scale that had tipped and finally come level. That evening, Miriam brought in a bowl of lentil soup, fragrant with cumin and garlic. We ate in easy quiet, the kind that needs no explanation. She didn't ask about the phone call, maybe she knew without being told, or maybe she understood that some things are better left in the gentle space between two people. Later, I stood in the doorway of her room. The curtains she'd sewn swayed lightly in the breeze from the open window. On the desk, a vase of fresh basil leaves gave off a faint green scent. The pale blue walls held no echo of my daughter anymore, they belonged entirely to the woman who lived within them. And for the first time since that morning when I'd been offered the garage, I felt the full weight of what it meant to reclaim not just a room, but the dignity that had been pushed to its edges. If you had the chance to give back the same treatment you received, would you take it? The seasons have turned twice since Miriam first set her suitcase down in the pale blue room. The house feels different now, not fuller in a noisy way, but steadier, like an old tree that's grown a new, strong branch. In the mornings, the scent of her cardamom tea mingles with the lavender I still keep in the drawer upstairs. She tends the garden as if it's a living member of the household, speaking to the marigolds in her soft, measured voice. I've learned her songs now, not the words, but the rise and fall of them, and sometimes I hum along while hanging laundry in the afternoon sun. My daughter and I speak occasionally, though never about the room. Our conversations are polite, like two people standing at the edges of a shared photograph, careful not to step too close. I no longer wait for her visits, or her approval. The ache that used to sit in my chest like a stone has softened into something I can carry without effort. Miriam and I have our own rituals now, a walk to the market on Fridays, soup on cold evenings, the exchange of small, wordless kindnesses. She has brought life into this house not by replacing what was lost, but by honoring what remains. Some afternoons, I sit by the window in the kitchen and watch her in the garden, the late light catching in her scarf. I think about how easily I might have kept that room empty, waiting for someone who had no intention of coming back. How easily I could have let my world shrink to fit the shape of absence. Instead, I chose otherwise. And that choice has grown into a life I could not have imagined on the day she first said garage. Today, the wind carries both lavender and basil through the open window. The marigolds sway, bright against the fading season. And I know, without ceremony, without doubt, that this house, this life, is mine again. Not because I took it back from someone, but because I gave it to someone who knew its worth.